What would it take for a 15-year-old boy to kill his own mother? A bad grade? A failed expectation? Or is there something much darker lurking beneath the surface? In the small town of DeBary, Florida, Gregory Ramos found himself trapped in a web of frustration, anger, and unmet expectations. When his mother, Gail Cleavenger, confronted him over yet another failing grade, the tension between them escalated. But what happened next was far beyond what anyone could have imagined. One argument, one outburst, and in the blink of an eye, a mother was dead. Gregory didn't just snap. He planned. He hid. And worst of all, he boasted, as if his mother's life was nothing more than a game to him. But how does a teenager, seemingly like any other, cross that line? What goes through the mind of someone who, in one night, goes from frustration to murder? And why would he brag about it to his friends? Today, we'll unravel the shocking story of Gregory Ramos, how one bad grade spiraled into a deadly act, how he manipulated the truth, and how his world, and the world around him, was forever changed. Welcome to another episode of True Crime Mystery Vault. If you're ready to explore the full story, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. This is the story of Gregory Ramos, and it all began with a bad grade. Before the murder, Gregory Ramos was just another 15-year-old boy, struggling to keep up with the pressures of school, family expectations, and growing up. Born and raised in DeBary, Florida, Gregory seemed like an average teenager, until the anger and frustration he had been bottling up for years finally exploded. DeBary, Florida, is a small, quiet town nestled about 30 miles north of Orlando, known for its peaceful streets and family-friendly atmosphere. The houses are modest, the yards neatly trimmed, and neighbors wave at each other on their morning walks. It's a place where the biggest concerns are the latest gossip or a neighbor's new dog. From the outside, Gregory's home on Saxon Boulevard was no different. It was a simple, well-kept house, much like any other in the neighborhood. But inside this seemingly normal home, something was brewing, a slow burn of tension that no one saw coming. For years, the cracks had been forming in Gregory's relationship with his mother. What had once been a close bond, built on love and care, was now crumbling under the weight of unmet expectations and unresolved emotional turmoil. At 15, Gregory was a high school sophomore at a local school. His life was marked by academic struggles. He had a history of poor grades and was constantly under the watchful eye of his mother, Gail Cleavenger. Gail, a woman in her 40s, was a devoted mother who did everything she could to push Gregory toward success. But the more she pushed, the more distant and resentful Gregory seemed to become. Gail Cleavenger wasn't the kind of mother who would sit idly by as her child failed. She was determined to see Gregory succeed, perhaps out of a desire to give him a better future, one that didn't mirror the struggles she had faced. But for Gregory, this constant pressure was suffocating. The expectations grew higher, the disappointments more frequent. Gregory was caught in a relentless cycle of underachievement and criticism. He couldn't meet his mother's standards, and this failure seemed to eat away at him with each passing day. In the months leading up to that fateful night, Gregory's grades had slipped even further. Despite his mother's repeated efforts, tutoring, extra study time, and constant reminders, his performance in school continued to fall short. The fights between Gregory and Gail became more frequent, more heated. The words exchanged during these arguments were laced with disappointment, anger, and a deepening frustration. Gregory felt trapped, suffocated by his mother's high expectations and his inability to escape the cycle of failure. Gregory's emotional state had become increasingly unstable. The frustration he felt in school bled into his home life, where the weight of his mother's disappointment sat like a stone in his chest. He didn't know how to talk about it. He didn't know how to tell her that he couldn't meet her expectations. Instead, he internalized it. The anger he felt toward himself turned outward, toward the one person who had always been in his life, the one person who was supposed to be his greatest source of support. The night of the murder began just like any other. An argument over his latest failing grade, another fight in a series of arguments they had been having for months. Gregory had received his report card, and it was more of the same. Poor grades, low marks, and a mother's disappointment. This time, something in Gregory snapped. The pressure that had been building for so long finally broke through. His resentment toward his mother, the anger at his own failures, the confusion about his future, all of it came to a head. As Gregory stood in the kitchen, his mother's words cutting deep, he felt a sense of rage building inside him, a rage that he couldn't control. In his mind, there was only one way to end the pain, to silence the source of his frustration. What started as a simple argument over schoolwork ended with a decision that no one could have anticipated. Gregory made the choice to murder his mother. In a matter of moments, Gregory's life and the life of his mother would be forever changed. He crossed a line that once crossed could never be undone. But the worst part wasn't just the murder. It was the actions that came afterward. The lies, the manipulation, the coldness with which he covered up his crime. Gregory didn't show remorse. Instead, he showed a chilling indifference to the consequences of his actions. His mother was gone, and in its place, he would create a story that would leave everyone around him in the dark. The argument wasn't anything new. Gregory had been struggling in school, and his mother had tried everything to help. But as she scolded him for yet another poor grade, something snapped in him. The words were sharp, the disappointment evident in her tone. He had heard it all before, but this time, it was different. The pressure of constantly failing, the anger at his own inability to live up to her expectations, it all became too much. His mother, in that moment, became the target of all his pent-up rage. It wasn't the words that broke him, it was the finality of his mother's voice, telling him that he was wasting his life, that he would amount to nothing. He had heard it 1,000 times, but this time, it cut deeper than ever before. In that instant, Gregory made a choice that would change everything. He decided to end it. Not just the argument, but everything. He would silence his mother once and for all. Gregory, in a fit of rage, grabbed the closest thing he could find, a cord. With his mother still talking, still yelling at him, he lunged at her, wrapping it around her neck. The force with which he did it is unimaginable. His hands shaking, his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't stop. The fight, the resistance, the panic in his mother's eyes, all of it was gone within minutes. The silence that followed was deafening. Gregory stood there, staring at the lifeless body of the woman who had given him everything. It wasn't just a crime of passion. It was cold, calculated, and swift. Gregory didn't panic at first. His mind was clear, his actions deliberate. In his mind, he had to cover it up. He had to hide what he had just done. His mother was gone, and now, the real work would begin. Gregory wasn't thinking of the weight of what he had just done. No, his mind was already focused on the next steps. He dragged his mother's body to the wheelbarrow, carefully hiding it underneath a blanket. Gregory carefully wheeled his mother's body to a secluded area of the churchyard. He dug a shallow grave, his movements steady, almost methodical. No one would know. No one would find out. As the dirt covered his mother's body, Gregory's mind seemed to settle. The weight of the murder, the act of burying his mother, he had done it, and now he would move on. But Gregory wasn't done yet. There was one last step to complete, covering his tracks. He returned home and staged the scene to look like a break-in. He ransacked the house, taking valuable items like electronics, and even a rifle from the garage. He made sure to make the scene look as chaotic as possible, as though a thief had come in and abducted his mother. The plan was simple. Get the police involved, let them think she had been taken. Gregory was cold in his execution of this final act, making sure to remove any trace of his involvement. It was all part of the perfect lie. But the most chilling part of this story wasn't just the crime. It was Gregory's behavior afterward. After he had covered up the murder, something inside him shifted. Instead of feeling remorse or guilt, Gregory began to boast about what he had done. It was as if the gravity of taking his mother's life didn't register with him. Instead, he found a sense of detachment, an eerie arrogance that only grew as he confided in his friends. Gregory reached out to his friends, Dylan Ceglarek and Brian Porras. Both were teenagers just like him, caught up in their own lives, their own struggles. But when Gregory told them what he had done, there was no horror in his voice, only a disturbing calmness. He described how he had killed his mother, how he had hidden her body, and how he had made it all seem like a robbery gone wrong. At first, Dylan and Brian didn't know what to say. They were in shock, unsure of how to react. But over time, Gregory's casual bragging wore them down. His detachment, his complete lack of remorse, made him seem like someone who had no fear of being caught. He even made light of the situation, as if it were something that could easily be brushed off. But for Dylan and Brian, this was no longer just a conversation between friends. They were now part of a dark secret, one that they weren't sure how to escape. Gregory's behavior continued to spiral. He had just committed murder, and yet he felt no guilt, no fear, only the strange, unsettling need to boast about it. The fact that he was so open about what he had done, that he wasn't hiding in shame, made the situation all the more chilling. It was as if the murder itself had become a twisted source of pride for him. And it wasn't just the bragging that disturbed everyone, it was the complete lack of remorse. Gregory didn't feel the weight of his crime. He didn't understand the gravity of taking a life, especially the life of his own mother. Instead, he acted like a spectator in his own story, watching it unfold with the calmness of someone who had nothing to lose. The morning after the murder, Gregory Ramos woke up and, for a moment, everything felt normal. But that would soon change. He had staged the scene to look like a burglary. An intruder had broken in, killed his mother, and taken off with some valuables. Now it was time to report her disappearance. On November 2nd, 2018, Gregory called 911 to report that his mother, Gail Cleavenger, had gone missing. He claimed that she had been abducted in the middle of the night during a break-in. The police arrived at the Ramos home in DeBary, and immediately the investigation began. They found signs of a forced entry. A broken window, drawers rifled through, and a few items missing, just as Gregory had described. At first glance, it seemed like the perfect crime, nothing more than a random act of violence. But something didn't sit right with the officers. Gregory's story was all too convenient. His behavior seemed off, too calm for someone whose mother had just been abducted. His answers were overly detailed, almost rehearsed. But it was the inconsistencies that really started to raise suspicions. Gregory said he had gone to bed the night before and hadn't heard anything unusual. Yet, when the police looked into the scene, they found traces of dirt and footprints that didn't match the evidence of a break-in. The timeline was vague. The details of his story didn't line up with the evidence, and Gregory's lack of genuine emotion only deepened the officers' concerns. The first breakthrough came when investigators found out that Gregory's mother, Gail, had been arguing with him over his failing grades just hours before her disappearance. It seemed that the emotional strain in their relationship might have been the key to understanding what had actually happened. The more the police dug into Gregory's background, the more they learned about his history of frustration, anger, and his struggles with his mother's expectations. But still, they didn't have enough evidence to directly accuse him. Then came the clue that cracked it all open: Gregory's friends. Dylan Ceglarek and Brian Porras had been the ones to hear Gregory's bragging about the murder. It didn't take long for the police to start speaking with them. At first, they were hesitant. After all, these were just teenage boys, caught up in a situation they hadn't asked for. But as the pressure mounted, Dylan started to crack. He began to open up about what Gregory had told him. He said Gregory had killed his mother over a bad grade, then staged the scene to cover it up. Dylan's confession sent shockwaves through the investigation. What had seemed like an open and shut case of an abduction was suddenly far more sinister. The pressure was now on Gregory. With the confession from his friends, the police knew they were getting closer. They confronted Gregory with the truth. The details his friends had provided matched the inconsistencies in his story. The police were relentless. Gregory was cornered, his story falling apart around him. For the first time since that night, he began to unravel. It was in that moment, under the weight of the mounting evidence and the pressure from his friends' cooperation, that Gregory finally broke down. He confessed. In a quiet, almost resigned tone, he admitted to strangling his mother during their argument. He led authorities to the churchyard where he had buried her body, the same church where he had taken her that night in a wheelbarrow. The confession was as chilling as it was unsettling. There was no remorse, only a quiet acceptance that he had been caught. Gregory's confession provided relief to the investigators, but it also left them in a state of disbelief. They had suspected him, but hearing him admit to the murder was a blow. The murder of a mother by her own son. It was the kind of case that rattles even the most seasoned detectives. But what shocked them even more was the complete lack of remorse Gregory showed in his confession. There was no emotion, no real understanding of the gravity of what he had done. It was as if the life he had taken was just another thing in his path. But Gregory wasn't the only one involved in this crime. Dylan Ceglarek and Brian Porras had their own roles to play in the aftermath. Once Gregory had committed the murder, the two boys became part of the cover-up. They helped Gregory destroy evidence, and as his co-conspirators, they hid what they knew. Dylan and Brian were complicit in the lie Gregory had created, but as the truth began to come out, they realized they couldn't keep the secret anymore. The influence Gregory had over his friends was undeniable. They were teenagers, caught up in his web of lies, unsure of what to do. Peer pressure, fear of being involved, and perhaps even the disturbing allure of Gregory's detachment from the crime made them hesitate. But eventually, both Dylan and Brian made the decision to cooperate with authorities. They admitted to their roles in helping cover up the murder, and they agreed to testify against Gregory. Their cooperation would lead to lighter sentences, but it didn't erase the moral questions surrounding their involvement. Could they have stopped Gregory? Or were they simply swept up in the chaos of a moment they couldn't control? Dylan and Brian were not hardened criminals, but teenagers trying to navigate a complicated, dangerous situation. Peer influence had played a significant role in their decisions. They hadn't planned to be part of a murder cover-up, but once they were involved, they didn't know how to back out. Gregory's arrogance and lack of remorse were so overwhelming that, for a time, they followed his lead. In the end, their cooperation with the authorities would help ensure that the truth came out. But the question remains, were they victims of Gregory's influence, or were they complicit in the crime? As the trial of Gregory Ramos unfolded, the focus shifted not only on the young man who had killed his mother, but also on those who had been drawn into his web of lies and deception. Gregory's friends, Dylan Ceglarek and Brian Porras, were no longer just passive bystanders. They had played an active role in helping to conceal the crime. Their involvement would bring additional legal drama, adding yet another layer to the already complex case. While Gregory's actions took center stage, the role of his friends was not overlooked by the court. Dylan and Brian had helped Gregory cover up the murder, knowingly destroying evidence and assisting in the staging of the robbery. They weren't just witnesses, they were complicit in the crime. At the trial, it became clear that Dylan and Brian were not going to be spared. Although they weren't charged with murder, their participation in the cover-up of Gail Cleavenger's death meant that they would still face serious consequences. The legal question now was how much responsibility they would bear for helping Gregory dispose of the body and fabricate the story of an abduction. Dylan Ceglarek, who had initially been shocked by Gregory's confession, became a key figure in the investigation. Under pressure, Dylan agreed to cooperate with authorities. He testified about what Gregory had told him, describing in disturbing detail how Gregory had bragged about killing his mother and how the two of them had helped him remove evidence from the scene. His cooperation led to a plea deal, a move that would reduce his sentence in exchange for his testimony against Gregory. Brian Porras, the second friend involved, was not as forthcoming at first. His reluctance to speak to the authorities was clear, but the mounting pressure from investigators and his own growing sense of guilt eventually led him to break his silence. Brian's testimony also helped piece together the chain of events, but unlike Dylan, he wasn't offered the same plea deal. Instead, he was sentenced to 14 years of probation and 364 days in jail. His sentence was seen as an attempt to balance accountability with the fact that, unlike Gregory, Brian had not directly committed the murder. Still, the court made it clear that his actions had consequences. The sentencing for Gregory Ramos, however, would be far more severe. His cold-blooded actions and complete lack of remorse left little room for leniency. Despite being just 15, he was sentenced to 45 years in prison. A lengthy sentence, one that would mean Gregory would spend the majority of his youth and most of his adult life behind bars. His plea deal to reduce the charges from first-degree to second-degree murder did little to soothe the wounds of the Cleavenger family, who felt the justice system hadn't done enough to punish Gregory for the brutal way in which he had ended his mother's life. As the gavel struck, marking the finality of Gregory's sentence, the courtroom fell silent. It was a moment of justice, but it was also a moment of grief. For the Cleavenger family, no amount of legal action could bring their loved one back. For Gregory's family, it was the tragic end to a story that had begun with hope and love but had ended in violence and betrayal. The courtroom was left to process the full weight of the tragedy. A mother lost, a son sentenced, and two young men whose lives would never be the same. The trial of Gregory Ramos, with its shocking revelations and devastating consequences, left a community grappling with questions of guilt, responsibility, and the tragic path that led a teenager to murder his own mother. It was a case that would haunt the small town of DeBary for years to come. As we close this heartbreaking chapter of the Gregory Ramos case, we're left with more questions than answers. Could someone have intervened? Could the endless cycles of anger, frustration, and disappointment have been broken before it led to such a devastating tragedy? The answers will forever remain elusive, but one thing is certain. This case will continue to haunt the community, the families involved, and all of us who have witnessed it. What do you think could have prevented Gregory's actions? Was this simply a tragic moment of rage, or do you believe there was something darker behind it all? Could his feelings of resentment and isolation have been addressed before it spiraled out of control? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Did Gregory's upbringing, the pressure he faced, or his lack of support drive him to commit this horrific act? We have uncovered this case. If you want to dive deeper into more shocking true crime cases, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. And until next time, stay safe, stay alert, and never take the people closest to you for granted, because you never know when everything could change.